Okay, I'm going to talk about the 3 C's related to loss and bereavement. The first C is the C of coping. In the last decade in particular, the psychology research has clearly shown that there's no one right way to cope. Very often people will come to me and say, I'm very worried about my husband. He doesn't seem to be dealing with this loss. He lost his father, he lost his mother, and he doesn't seem to be crying, he doesn't seem to be talking about it. Or there'll be variations on the theme in many different ways. It's often men feeling that their wives or daughters or sisters are crying too much, and vice versa, with the women being concerned that the men aren't talking enough. But again, there are tremendous exceptions to this. So I just want to share with you a few basic thoughts about coping, but what it boils down to is contained in a machlokas in the Gemara three times that I know of, between Rav Ami and Rav Asi, on the pasuk of Dago B'levish Yashchena. So it says in Mishnah, it says, if you have a worry in your heart, dampen it down. So Chad Amar Yashchena Midato. One way of saying it is, you have a worry in your heart, push it down. Don't think about it too much. Distract yourself. The other way is, if you have a worry in your heart, Yasichena La'acherim. Find somebody to talk about it to, and talk to that person. Interestingly, our rabbis don't tell us that one way is better than the other. They don't say that the mandamar who says Yasichena La'acherim, that's a better way to go than the distractor. Exactly, that's what the research shows us. Let's say a child, for example, has to have a difficult medical procedure. So you're getting ready to give him this painful shot, this painful injection. They find that kids' ways of coping go into 2 categories. One are distractors. They don't want to know about it. They don't want to think about it. They just want the game system to play with to get their mind off it. The other category are the kids who want to talk about it, want to know about it, want to do the research on it. They say, can't I get a new doctor? And if you insist on still giving them the painful injection, they'll insist on doing it themselves or helping the doctor do it. Interestingly, if you don't go according to their style, they fall apart. If you shove the game system into the hand of the attender, the one who needs to talk, the sin of Yasichena La'acherim, then you're in trouble, because basically that's not his style. And if you shove the internet article about alternative procedures into the hand of the distractor, you're in trouble as well. Let me tell you a story that for me is my best way of understanding the importance of this and the take-home message on the sea of coping. It goes like this. I was in Israel during the height of the Second Intifada, and I was giving a lecture at the Jerusalem Trauma Center, where there was a group of, if I remember correctly, about 30 to 40 therapists who specialize in trauma. Interestingly, they know much more about trauma than I ever will. They needed an outsider because Ein Chavish Matratz Momi Beis Hashem. You could be the biggest expert in the world in dealing with loss and dealing with grief and helping others through the stresses in their lives. But when it happens to you, you can't free yourself from your own prison. So I was speaking there. And in the middle of my talk, the word came that there was a bombing in the Hebrew University cafeteria, and 9 people were killed. 7 of them happened to be Americans. So immediately, everybody in Israel knows everybody else. All these therapists are called out to deal with the aftermath of that horrible tragedy. And all that was left in the trauma center were 3 therapists, the director, the assistant director, and myself. And another call comes in that there was a camp in the middle of the country, and that summer camp, one of their counselors had been killed in this horrible bombing. So the director of the center asked me if I could go with his assistant director and spend the day with the kids, tell them about the tragedy, and help them deal with the aftermath of this loss of their beloved counselor. So the assistant director and I go into her car and we drive to the middle of the country, and immediately the director of the camp is waiting for us. He doesn't let us run the show. I should have known better. In Israel, they're certainly not going to let an American tell them what to do. He immediately puts me and my colleague in the corner, and he tells the kids the horrible news. He tells them, look, there are 5 coping rooms. One room is a room where you write letters to the parents of your beloved counselor about what a wonderful woman she was. Another room is an art room. Express yourselves artistically. Third room is a music room. Fourth room is a tefillah room where they could daven. And a fifth room is the talking room. The kids were told that they could go from room to room throughout the day, but not a single kid switched rooms. They divided themselves at their own volition equally between 4 of the 5 rooms. The one room that wasn't picked, interestingly, was the tefillah room, probably because they were in a state of aninus. It was too soon to daven. The funeral hadn't even taken place yet. But a quarter of the kids spent the day talking to me and my colleague. A quarter of the kids wrote, a quarter of the kids did art, and a quarter of the kids did music. And I learned an incredible, incredible lesson from this incident. A week later, as I remember it, I was back in the United States, and I was asked to give a talk to a group of people commemorating the first anniversary of 9/11. And I told over this story. To me, it was an amazing, amazing story. I learned a lot from it. There's the Ashchena, there's the Asichena Lacherim. And a woman in the audience told me the following amazing story, and with this I'll end the Sea of Coping. She said that her father was a Vishnitzer Chassid who was the bunkmate of Elie Wiesel in the concentration camp. In fact, in that famous picture of Elie Wiesel peering out with some of his fellow adolescents, her father was one of them. And Professor Wiesel had given a talk in Manhattan the week before, and her father said, give him regards, he might remember me. So she waits online afterwards, gives regards from her father, and he immediately, his eyes tear up, and he says, your father isn't sure if I remember him? Didn't he tell you how he saved my life? And he tells the following story. He says, there was a day that was horrible even by concentration camp standards. They were beyond endurance in terms of being beaten and starved and undergoing unbelievable suffering, as we've all heard. And a group of Russian prisoners of war got a hold of some rat poison. And they were waiting online, each taking the dose of rat poison and laying down to die. All of the adolescents in that section of the camp looked at each other, including Elie Wiesel, and they decided that, you know what, they're going to kill us anyway. Let's take matters into our own hands. And they went online behind the Russians, and Dr. Wiesel said he fully intended on making those the last moments of his life. He was going to take the poison. But he said, your father, who retained his faith, even there, went to the side of the line, and he broke into the ancient Vishnitzer Nigun, Frani Mamin Be'amuna Shlema B'vias HaMashiach. I believe in ultimate redemption. He said, your father's song broke our suicidal spell. One by one, we left the line. One by one, we surrounded your father and joined him in singing the Ani Mamin. He says, go home and tell your father, Sheli Shelach. Anything that I've accomplished is in part because of your father's nigun. So again, that's the end of the Sea of Coping. Don't let anybody tell you the right way to cope. People have to find their old toolbox of coping mechanisms. It's never just one thing. There are times that it'll be talking. There are times that it'll be crying. There are times that it'll be learning. And there are times that it's going to be very different. Spouses often have different styles. Fathers and sons, mothers and daughters often have different styles. The key is to remember that, as Rav Hirsch said, it's not Keli Lama Azaftani. The vowelization is Lama Azaftani. We have to change from the why to the what. What am I going to do with this? How am I going to cope with it? And that's ultimately one of the most important lessons I've learned about bereavement. Interestingly, when in therapy I'm working with children who have gone through very tough times, be it bereavement, losses, or some kind of traumatic event, an accident, and somebody they're close to, we actually help them very concretely build up a toolbox of coping mechanisms. They'll talk about some upsetting event that might have happened in their life, or they may see a little film clip of something upsetting being depicted. We then have them go to a table where we have set up 13 different coping mechanisms. There are perfumes, and there are different kinds of sports magazines, there are music players, you name it, we have it. Different ways of either the samach of hesach hadas, of distraction, the distraction kind of coping mechanisms, or the sin of yasichena la'acherim, of talking things out. And then they gather literally a toolbox of coping mechanisms. They usually settle on 3 or 4 that work best for them over the period of time that we work with them. And they become very mindful about what works for them when. There are 2 more points I want to make about coping before I end this section. One has to do with the fact that coping is often something that is a source of stress between husbands and wives. I alluded to that before. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is that each member of a couple respect the right of the alternate coping mechanisms, because it's rare that couples grieve together or families grieve together the same way. You could come up with a shloshim process, or the year of Avelus, the year of mourning, and there may be a totally different pace. Children's pace of mourning is totally different than adults' pace of mourning. But I want to share with you a vignette and a thought. I have a colleague, his name is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. He's one of the leading experts in trauma throughout the world. And he once showed me the picture of a man's brain. It was an fMRI, where there's a brain scan you could take with somebody as they're experiencing certain emotions. And this was an individual who was caught in the stairwell of the World Trade Center on 9/11. And he was having a flashback now to the worst moment of his life, when he was convinced that he was about to die. Literally, one of the world's tallest buildings is crumbling around him, and he's trying to run for safety. And he showed me this picture of what it looks like when an individual is experiencing the worst moment of his life. You know what your brain looks like at that moment? Literally, the language centers of the brain are shut down. Literally, Broca's area, which is the name of the language centers of the brain, you're rendered speechless. But not just speechless, it's demimus. In Hebrew, the word demimus is a word reserved for total speechlessness, totally being without words. When Aaron loses his sons tragically and suddenly, the word the Torah uses is vayidom Aaron, not sheket, as the Barbanel says. Vayidom is because the mimus is for total shutdown of language. But then, what Dr. van der Kolk showed me, which is the main point I want to make here on this component of coping, is that as he worked with this 9/11 survivor, and as he gave him words for his pain, literally lighting up the language centers of the brain, that's when healing came. That as he engaged him in talking about exactly what happened and the meaning of what happened, that's when healing comes. Now, it's not always with words. As I said before, sometimes it's with meaning through learning, or through doing acts of chesed, or through somehow finding some other unique meaning. And that's a very, very important point It's the power of lighting up the language centers of the brain. Rabbi Charlap, in the early 1900s in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, had a Haggadah called Mei Moro. And in it he says that slavery, going back to our days in Egypt, takes away our koach hadibur, takes away our power of speech. And when we as Jews gather around the table on Seder night, what's it called? Magid, because we're naming the monster. We're opening up our mouths and our hearts, giving meaning to our history of losses and of suffering. And that's the next point of coping I want to make. It's true that distraction is valid in its time, talking is valid in its time, but ultimately finding meaning through lighting up the language centers of the brain is ultimately something that everybody who goes through a loss has to find their own unique way of doing that. And now a word on tears. I'm just going to end with a word on tears, a little bit on the research on tears. Imagine a 4-year-old boy is lost in the supermarket. He can't find his mother anywhere. And he's walking around from aisle to aisle in a state of panic. He's now in fight or flight, state of high physiologic arousal, but he's not crying. If you had a picture of his nervous system at that point, he's in fight or flight. What happens the second he sees his mother? So now he's safe. Totally illogically. You know what happens? He starts to cry. And if you had a picture of his nervous system at that point, it's shifting over for fight or from fight or flight into a place of finding comfort. Ironically, tears are often an amazing, amazing source of comfort. Our rabbis tell us, amazingly in a non-Western way, the Tiferes Yisrael says in his commentary on the Mishnah, where it says, Al tanachem chavercha b'shas meso muta lefanav. Don't try to console somebody when his loss is very fresh, and literally it's before the burial. He says something that makes no sense to the Western ear. He says, the adarabba, on the contrary, when he sees that you're not trying to comfort him, he'll cry more. What does that mean, he'll cry more? Doesn't make any sense. So let me illustrate this with the story and with the thought. The story is, the thought is that we now know that tears are often therapeutic. There are stress hormones released in tears. And here's the story. An amazing story from Rabbi Lau, the former chief rabbi of Israel. I think he's currently the chief rabbi in Tel Aviv. And he says the following amazing story about when he, as a little boy, got out of the concentration camps. He said they were beyond tears when they were in the concentration camps. And they're taken in to this orphanage in France. And a very loving substitute mother was the house mother in the orphanage, and she was caring for them. And the word came that there was going to be a special kind of an assembly where a group of, I think, French Jews were going to give these children who survived the camps a gift. And the children hear about this, and they were incredibly angry. They said, what do you mean you're going to give us gifts? We don't want gifts from you. What we wanted is for you to save us from our suffering back then. It's irrational maybe to blame these French Jews, but they were incredibly enraged. And they said, we're going to boycott this ceremony, we're not going to go. The house mother, who they loved very much, said, please go, it's going to embarrass me, you don't have to accept the gifts, just go. So they go, they say, we're not going to accept any of these gifts, and they hear what must have been boring speech after boring speech from the French dignitaries. And then finally, the last speech, an elderly survivor gets up, and he looks at the children, and he says, Kinder, Tyra Yiddische Kinder. And he breaks down crying. He can't go on. He just starts crying. Suddenly, one of these child survivors starts crying. Then the next child starts crying. Pretty soon, there was a crescendo of loud, ceaseless sobbing coming from these children. And the French don't know what to do. They can't stop it. They have no idea how to handle it. So they are in a state of shock. But one of the oldest survivors gets up. One of the oldest surviving children gets up. And he quotes by heart the passage of Atzamos Yuveshos. And here's what he says. He says, you know something? He says, until now, we were beyond tears. We were like dried up old bones. We couldn't cry. We came here. You came to this asifa to give us gifts. And you just gave us the biggest gift you possibly could have given. This survivor gave us the gift of our tears. Thank you for changing us and delivering us from the Atzamos Yuveshos to a place where we were able to cry, the greatest gift of all. Just finished the sea of coping, and now in a somewhat briefer way, I'm going to talk about the sea of connection, which is extremely important. My favorite psychological study on connection is a great metaphor for what many people going through the grief process can immediately relate to when you realize the power of not feeling alone during a funeral and a shivah and even beyond. The sea of connection is about, in part, what we learned from a study where they take people and they put them on the bottom of a hill. When you're on the bottom of a hill and you're asked by the researchers to estimate the steepness of the hill. If you're alone, you tend to estimate the hill as being very steep. If you have somebody at your side, the hill looks less steep. The closer you are to the person at your side, the less steep the hill looks and the less tired you get walking up the hill. That's the key of the sea of connection. I heard a beautiful thought from Rabbi Shapiro, who gave a talk to a group at a High Lifeline of adult survivors of cancer. And he made a great point that I like to quote on the sea of connection. He talks about a word that we see many times in Nach. The Hebrew word for desolation is called neshama, nun, shin, mem, he. And under the shin is the vowel called a patach, an asan, neshama, okay? That means desolation. You see it many times in various parts of Nach. Desolation is neshama. Interestingly, the very same letters, the very same four letters, if it's pronounced neshama, means soul. Interesting. Same words, you go from desolation to soul. He says, what's the key of going from desolation to soul? He says, think of neshama, which is desolation. That's a patach. That's the ah sound. He says to convert it into a soul, into neshama, you have this little line. A little bit of support is what brings us from desolation to support. From desolation to neshama, a place of feeling spiritual and connected and reconnected. Death takes us away often from connection. That's why the brilliant wisdom of Judaism in terms of how to deal with the different levels of mourning is amazingly, amazingly powerful psychologically as we gradually reconnect to the community in more and more deep ways as we go through the various stages of grief and grieving, and we go from ultimately a gradual withdrawal to the end of the year, a gradual reconnection to the world. 2 points I want to make about the psychology of connection. Number one is you have to get assertive about knowing how to ask for the right kind of connection. Very often people give the wrong connections at the wrong time, and we have to learn how to ask for it. After 9/11, 6 months after 9/11, there was a needs assessment group that OHEL put together in their offices with a number of Jewish families who lost family members in the World Trade Center and plane plane crashes that led to the collapse of the World Trade Center. And they asked members of the Jewish community who had direct loss, how can we be most helpful to you in organizing services? OHEL was coordinating through Project Liberty the mental health services. And the number one request of these bereaved individuals who suddenly lost fathers, sons, mothers, daughters, husbands, wives, they all said pretty much the same thing as their main need. Help us negotiate the right kind of connections. At the beginning, often they were drowning in the chicken soup of love and support that was overwhelming. They didn't know quite how to handle it. But then, as often happens, starting 6 months later, 7 months later, 8 months later, they noticed that people started avoiding them. One woman mentioned she'd be walking down the street in her neighborhood, and she'd clearly see people who were old friends of hers from before, and they'd cross the street to avoid her, not because they were bad people, but because they were uncomfortable and they didn't know how to relate to her now that the initial shock was gone. An extremely important part of converting from desolation to soulfulness, from neshama to neshama, is the ability to learn how to ask assertively for different kinds of help. Sometimes you just need somebody to be at your side. Sometimes you need somebody who's going to be there to talk to you. Sometimes you're going to need somebody to give you concrete kind of help. But the most important point I want to make about connection has to do with the role of the community in knowing how to titrate out, how to measure out the right kinds of support. I'll tell you a story from my practice. I was seeing a boy who had lost his father a number of years before I saw him. I wasn't seeing him because of bereavement. He was doing fine. By the way, if God forbid a child loses a parent, the best predictor of how well that child will do is how well the surviving parent is doing in being there for the child in a consistent, loving kind of way. Not easy to do that initially, but over the long haul, that's the key predictor. But I was talking to him, and he was going to a very orthodox yeshiva. And they were very actively observant, towards the right side of observance in terms of level of strictness of observance. And I'm talking to him. He was coming to me for a totally different reason, but I don't even know why I asked him. I said, tell me what your Shabbos is like in your house. So he says, let me tell you what happens. He says, Friday night, I'm in my room, I have my headphones on, and I'm watching television. And I said, and what about your mother? He says, oh, she's in her room crying. And I said, and what about your other siblings? They're all in their room. I don't know what they're doing. They're probably listening with their headphones to different music or whatever. I said, but your family is observant. They don't do that kind of stuff on Shabbos. And I said, and what about shul? What about Kiddush? She says, shul? He laughs. I can't sit next to my father anymore. I don't know where to sit. I have no place to be in shul. I don't go to shul anymore on Shabbos. I said, and what about making Kiddush for the family? You're the oldest son. He laughs at me. He says, no, my mother cries because it's just a reminder to her of the loss. So I said, what about meals? Aren't you invited for meals? He said, no. So I got his permission to contact his mother. I called his mother, and she felt terrible. She said, yeah, it's all true. It's all true. She said, but frankly, at the beginning, after the loss of my husband, I was inundated with invitations, and I kept saying no because I wasn't ready for it. Then, when I was ready, about 6 months later, the invitations had dried up. So I got permission to make 2 phone calls, to call my patient's rabbi and to call the principal of his school. We live in a wonderful community. That's all it took. His rabbi immediately arranged for him to have somebody to sit next to, and arranged for the invitations to come. They were constantly invited to meals after that every Shabbos. And the head of his school made sure that all of the students in the school invited him. It took care of the problem completely. But we have to keep in mind that after our initial natural outpouring, I'm talking to you not as directly bereaved people, but actually, even as the directly bereaved, you have to know how to recruit the right kind of support. It changes over time. And community leaders need to learn how to be quarterbacks to keep checking in. And one last quick vignette. After the hurricane in the Gulf, Hurricane Katrina, there was a grant that Mount Sinai Hospital had for work with clergy people that I was invited to be the psychologist, something called compassion fatigue. I was meeting with a group of clergy, and one of the rabbis in that area told me the following story, and with this I'll end the Sea of Connection. He said Friday night in his synagogue, 21-year-old boy who he hadn't seen in the 2 years since Katrina comes to shul. And he gives him a big hug, and he says, "Oh, we're so happy to have you," and everybody in shul gives him a warm hello. And that Sunday morning, he gets a call from this congregant who he thought had left. And the congregant said the following. He says, "You know something?" He said, "I had felt totally disconnected from connection to anybody. My parents left the neighborhood. I sort of dropped out from going to shul anymore. I felt totally alone in the world, and I decided to kill myself. I decided to end my life. But I figured I'd say goodbye to some of the people I knew in the old shul I went to growing up. And when you and everybody else asked me, 'How are you doing?' and gave me a hug, it renewed my sense of connection in the community." He says, "Rabbi, I want you to know that your question, 'How are you doing?' and the accompanying hug saved a life." The third C and the final C I want to talk about is the C of creating meaning. It's interesting. Rav Schwab, I think quoting Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, says that the Hebrew word for comfort, the Hebrew word for nechama, doesn't really mean comfort. If you look in the Torah, the first time the word nechama appears is the very end of Parshas Bereishis. It's God is looking down in the world, and it says, "Ki nichamti ki asisem," sort of a reconsideration whether or not to create man. And throughout the Torah, the word nechama is really a shift in perspective, Rabbi Schwab says. A shift in perspective. Peninachem ha'am v'shavu mitzrayim. Again, the word means a shift in perspective. What does that mean? It means that over time, as people find meaning in their loss, and it takes a while, sometimes it happens quicker, sometimes it happens slower, but it's often one of the most powerful sources of coming to terms with the loss. And it varies. Nobody could tell you how to handle it. The Talmud tells us that im ira davarav, something bad happens to you, what should your response be? Yifashvesh b'masav. After you do the first line response of seeing if there's something deficient in your observance of learning Torah, and you don't find anything, so the answer is you do a self-examination. You find, what meaning does it have to you? Our commentaries say, or they don't say, maybe that's really the more important issue here, is they don't tell you what the answer is. They say you have to do your own internal self-examination. That's what the word pishpush means. Yefashvesh is you literally do this cheshbon hanefesh, this internal kind of examination to determine what your source of nechama is going to be, what your source of shift in perspective is going to be. Let me tell you a quick thought that I experienced at a Chai Lifeline retreat where we were discussing a medrash. There's a medrash that says on the passage, Hashem Tzadik Yivchan, says that righteous people get tested. And the medrash makes two analogies. One analogy is that when righteous people are tested, it's like a barrel maker. And in the process of making barrels, only the soundest barrels are used in the process. Only the soundest barrels can withstand tests. So according to this way of thinking, in fact, when somebody is going through very tough times in life, a tough loss, tough illness in a family member, It's like being a barrel. It's like being a barrel where if you're being tested this way, it's because God thinks you could withstand it, and God thinks you're a righteous person. Problem is, many people are offended by that imagery. In a Chai Lifeline retreat where we have parents whose children are seriously sick, or God forbid they lose a child, they say, my child should suffer because I'm such a righteous person. I'd rather be a bad person. The other analogy used in that medrash is not to a barrel, it's to flax. In the process of making flax, the more you hit the flax, the more strengthened the flax becomes. So the very nature of the production of flax is strengthening through suffering. According to that way of thinking, that component of the meaning of going through loss is that it strengthens you. It says in this magnificent, magnificent Medrash Tehillim, and I'll translate this, what I think is some of the most beautiful words in the Hebrew language, very well known. Ilu nafalti lo kamti. If I never fell down, I never would have gotten up. Ilu yashafti bachoshech lo haya orli. If I never sat in the darkness, I never would have appreciated the light. That second version, many, many more people find comforting. Because to find the growth-inducing properties of going through tough times and all the psychological research is associated with growth. Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik used to talk about two approaches to suffering in life. Yiyud versus Gorel. Gorel means that you're like a log floating on the river at the mercy of the current. You're passive. Bad things happen to you, maybe because you're unlucky. Yiyud means that you're a person of destiny. It's happening to you because this is your destiny. You're going to grow through this. In a fascinating recent publication, a man by the name of Dr. Salovey, who's the current new president of Yale University, wrote a paper where he did 3 studies looking at what's essentially Yiyud versus Gorel, saying that if you have this what's called post-traumatic growth approach, I grow through going through tough times, you do much better. Do you know who Salovey is, the new president of Yale? It's short for Soloveitchik. Cousins. Not necessarily an observant cousin, but they think the same way. They come from the same dynasty. They come from the Brisker dynasty. Amazing. I was blown away when I saw it. One day I want to send an email or a letter to Dr. Salovey to see if I could share with him some of the thinking of his illustrious cousin, Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik. But the bottom line here on meaning making is there's 2 streams of thinking. In Jewish thinking, we're encouraged to see loss and suffering as flax, as the darkness leading to the greater appreciation of the light. In psychological research, all the new studies are showing the same thing. It's the key ingredient to resilience. And in terms of the bottom line of meaning making, everybody has to find their own way at their own pace. Sometimes it may take years before they could really find their own post-traumatic growth in response to a loss. We can't undo a loss easily. It's there. A death is something that's permanent. But I'll just end this final C with one of my favorite parables, well-known parable from the Duvna Maggid. The Duvna Maggid talks about a king who had a crown. And in the center of the crown there was a diamond. And it was known throughout the world, this diamond was the biggest and best in the world. It was bigger than the Hope Diamond. One day the king wakes up and he finds a flaw has developed right down the center of the diamond. And he's spooked by it. He sees it as a terrible omen. Puts a call to the kingdom saying, anybody who could fix this flaw in the diamond, I'll make wealthier beyond his wildest dreams. People come from all over the world. Can't fix the flaw in the diamond. A flaw in the diamond is something that can't really be fixed. little old Jew comes in and he takes an engraving tool and he engraves magnificent leaves around the floor that now becomes the trunk of the tree that make the diamond even more beautiful than it was before. That's the key. That's the key. The key is flax. Flax is about understanding that through our losses we grow, we become deeper people. Now some people, I should just tell you, at a Chai Lifeline retreat, there were some people who were more comforted by the barrel analogy. One couple, the wife was only comforted by the barrel analogy. The husband was infuriated by the barrel analogy. He was only comforted by the flax analogy. And you know what? They were both right.